Welcome to Paulogia Live, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians live here on my YouTube channel from Paulogia Studios in lovely Nova Scotia, Canada, where it is near midnight, but not quite the witching hour yet. I appreciate everyone hanging out with me today, and Happy New Year, Happy 2023. This is our first stream of 2023. And for those of you who are familiar with my main channel, may well know that my first video of the year on the main channel is always Hammy New Year with the lovely and talented and brilliant Shannon Q as my guest. We have done this several years in a row now, and we recorded that yesterday. Normally, well, I shouldn't say normally. It seems like every year it takes us a little bit longer to do it. And yesterday, our recording, a bit of a behind the scenes for you, our recording was over 6 hours for the episode that will hopefully be, well, I don't know how long it'll be, but shorter than 6 hours. So anyway, that was fun. We are both a little bit suffering from that, since normally it's a bit of a spirited affair, shall we say. But we had a great time. And taking a break from editing, I thought I would do my first live stream of the year so that I can concentrate tomorrow on working on editing and all that kind of thing. So welcome to everyone. I see Rogue Skeptic, I see Flume666, I see Maynard Saves, Michael Mesmeros, a lot of normal faces here. Hopefully we, because it's a different time than we normally stream, that maybe we get some new people as well. But welcome here. So, the way the Paulogia Live show works is that we have some predetermined topics that we talk about. Normally they are videos I respond to or articles, but today they're all videos. And should any super chats come in during the conversations, which I encourage you to do, send me a super chat. Hopefully we can get some great conversations going and some great questions, but those we will handle at the end, afterwards. We've got a bit of a, just I guess in the spirit of overextending myself, we've got quite a few videos today. So I should probably jump in straight, we got quite a few videos to look at today, so I should probably jump straight in. The first one today that we are looking at is from my good friends at Answers in Genesis Canada. Those of you who have been following the channel for a while may remember that when I lived in Alberta several years ago, I was set to attend the Alberta Homeschool Conference, where Ken Ham and the Answers in Genesis Canada folks were going to be speaking and selling materials. And we had a bit of a conflict. We had a bit of a situation, shall we say. But that's all. Bygones be bygones. It's in the past. But Calvin Smith, the gentleman who called me, left a message on my cell phone to let me know that I was disinvited from some events. Anyhow, this is the first time I think I've had Calvin on my channel, so we are going to see what he has to say regarding the Bible and science.
Millions of years into the Bible, trying to add millions of years into the Bible destroys the concept of biblical authority. Now, let me put it
right off the bat, big claim. Trying to look at science in the Bible destroys biblical authority. Of course, if you are Answers in Genesis, this is absolutely what you believe. However, millions of Christians around the world are able to separate science and the Bible. In fact, even the congregation that I attended, the denomination that I was a part of, part of what we said about inerrancy, and a lot of churches are like this, and I think a lot of people are like this, the Bible is inerrant in all that it intends to teach, or in all that it intends to say. So, and a lot of people would say, well, the Bible is not a science book. The Bible is not intended to teach us science. The Bible is intended to teach us about theology and teach us about God and perhaps teach us about history, depending on how you're looking at it. Anyway, big, bold statement by Calvin. Us versus them, setting up a dichotomy.
This way. Here's a question I like to ask Christians that believe in millions of years and the whole secular geologic timescale. Can you tell me your top
Secular geological timescale. Of course, geological timescale was not developed secularly. It was developed through science. Many Christians, many people of other religions, for example, all accept geological timescale. So even just flavoring it as the secular geological timescale is another us versus them, answers in Genesis versus Christians. And by the way, that's what this whole video is about. It's not for me, it's not for atheists, but I'm still, as a former Christian and a former young earth creationist, these hit home and I like to talk about them.
3 Bible verses that convinced you that God used millions of years to create? You know,
Can you give me 3 Bible verses that convinced you that God used millions of years to create? So that's his gotcha question, as if you should be using everything from the Bible. So, but can you give me 3 Bible verses that tells me that the moon orbits the earth? Can you give me 3 Bible verses that tells me the atomic weight of gold? Can you give me 3 Bible verses that tells me in what year Jesus was? Well, no, that's not a good example. Can you give me 3 Bible verses that tells me in what year Jerusalem was destroyed? Can you give me 3 Bible verses that tells me that the wolves are canines? These are questions that the Bible is not attempting to answer. Can you give me 3 Bible verses that tells me how many planets there are orbiting our sun? These are just, again, category error. I think if I was a Christian, I would be rather offended by this, that the only knowledge that we can have of anything is from the Bible, and clearly that's not the intent.
There's usually a lot of crickets going on at that point because it's usually not the Bible at all that brought them to that conclusion. It's the influence of secular teaching that has brought them to try to fit these ideas into the Bible when they really aren't there at all.
Nope, not the influence of secular teaching. The influence of discoveries about the natural world. Now, when you are a Christian, most Christians believe in 2 types of revelation. They believe in the revelation of the Bible, direct revelation, but they also believe in natural revelation. They believe that the natural order is in and of itself part of what God is telling us about himself. Look at the trees. So when you're a Christian, you can't put one book above the other. You don't put nature above the Bible, and you don't put Bible above nature. If God is true, those 2 things will harmonize, right? And so when you discover something in the natural revelation, you need to harmonize it in much the same way as if you have 2 Bible verses that seem to contradict. You need to figure out how to harmonize those 2 things. Is it grace or is it faith which saves us? Well, we need to figure that out. We need to come up with ways to reconcile those things. So our observation of geological time is part of our input by which we evaluate the revelation in the Bible. That's just always been the case.
Now look, when scientists say that events and processes happen in a kind of a vastly different time scale than the Bible records, some people just deal with this by putting, well, that's scientific arguments over here and biblical information over here, different.
I do think that's true. I think a lot of people do that. They say, well, the Bible says one thing, nature says other thing. I'm just going to have cognitive dissonance or just ignore one or the other. That's fine. But there are millions of Christians who look at the geological column, they look at the geological time frames and all the evidence there, and they don't see any conflict. It's about interpretation of one or the other. You don't have to put them in separate boxes, though perhaps you should.
Categories. This is science and this is the Bible. But in the minds of many, and especially our young people in school, science, because it's considered authoritative about the real world, is what is trusted about history and about nature. And because of this, science is usually treated as objectively true, while biblical concepts, well, they become kind of thought of as subjectively true. And
well, this is perhaps appropriate. So when you're talking about something being objectively true, that means that you have something external to a entity or a mind that you can evaluate the claims against. That is not subjective, is literally it's of the subject. Now, when we look at science, science is evaluated by how well it makes predictions about the real world, about the natural world. And that is absolutely an objective standard, because it's not up to me or Calvin or any of you watching to independently decide at what at what temperature water boils at sea level. That's a purely objective external thing that can be evaluated. So in this sense, science absolutely is objective. And if the Bible is not making claims that have predictive power, for example, it is. And if you're using it to evaluate, how you should live your life, that is absolutely, interpretation is a subjective standard about you as a subject. In this way, absolutely, one is objective and one is subjective. Science, while there is interpretation in some of the results of science, the observations themselves, the observation that it is 100 degrees Celsius when water boils at sea level, that observation is not subjective.
When biblical concepts are treated as subjective, they can easily be dismissed as unimportant, but they're not.
They're not what? They're not easily dismissed, or they're not unimportant, or both. I don't know. Or they're not subjective, perhaps all three. I actually agree that at some point, when you are looking at the Bible purely as allegory and purely as advice and all those kind of things, the way some people look at the Bible, it can be easily dismissed. It does need to have some objective validation for me to be taking it seriously and to weighing it into my factors of my life. So, absolutely, Calvin.
Now, we'll cover the difference between operation and historical, or what we call origin science, in another episode. But for now, let's just remember that origin science represent one-time, unrepeatable events, and here, the usual, scientific methods from experimental science just don't apply. We need to...
That's wrong. So, one of the things that Answers in Genesis likes to hang their hat on is that the definition of science is observable and repeatable. But the scientific method is obviously not one single thing, but in general, science wants to make predictions about the future. That's why it's useful to us. That's why we can launch space shuttles and have a cell phone and cure disease or treat disease, because science allows us to make predictions about the future. It is not entirely about repeatability. So, for example, well, look, I'll leave some example because he's going to give some. But that science needs to be repeatable to be science is absolute garbage. Science just needs to make predictions.
Understand that there's been a lot of unprovable assumptions made in developing theories about the age of the Earth and events of the past, and there's bias there.
He's not entirely wrong that there are some unprovable assumptions that go into science. Probably the biggest one is the regularity of nature, in that the way the laws of physics that work today have worked that way in the past and will continue to work that way in the future. That is just something we take axiomatically or presuppositionally. Absolutely it is. So we cannot prove that thousands and thousands of years ago that the decay rate of a certain radioisotope was exactly the way it is now. However, the most reasonable assumption seems to be that it was, in all the time we've been observing radio decay rates, for example, it has never varied. And unless someone gives us a good reason to think that these kind of things vary, or gravity, or of any other constants, the speed of light, that kind of thing, we are justified in thinking that those things are uniformitarianism or uniformity, until we are shown otherwise, that that axiom or that presupposition is no good. And guess what? The second that some of those things can be shown to be changeable, then we will change our presupposition that they don't change. However, we make the best predictions by assuming that they do. That's the main thing. So, of course, the young earth creationists, a lot of times, they want to say things like, the speed of light may have been different in the past, or the decay rates may have been different in the past. All these kind of things that they want to just hang their hat on, well, we can't prove it. Yeah, they're not wrong. So actually, and we as non-believers in some of the young earth creationist stuff should own that some things, like the reliability of our senses, for example, that they're reliable enough, and that we use that we use instruments and other things, that even though those instruments require our senses as well, that we have methods of cross-checking ourselves and doing that kind of thing. You know, some of these things are presuppositions, that they exist. So let's not be dogmatic and pig-headed and foolish about it. So Calvin's right, very briefly. We can't prove it, but they are the most reasonable thing to believe.
Based on people's worldview, and we'll get into that in other episodes. But basically, there's a big difference between someone, using science to figure out what water boils at sea level on our planet, through a repeatable experiment, and trying to use historical science to figure out, if it was Mr. Green or Professor Plum who killed the victim in the conservatory with the candlestick, if you know where I'm coming from, when no one's...
Okay, so he gave an example there of what he thinks are two different things you can't determine by science. He seems to think that in the real world clue game, you cannot tell if it's Mr. Green who killed in the conservatory with the candlestick via science, because it's not repeatable. However, if it was Mr. Green in the conservatory with the candlestick, you can then make predictions about what kind of observations you will find. So, for example, you may find a candlestick with blood on it, and or the wounds on the victim will be the same measurements and have the same pattern as the candlestick in question that you suspect that he killed them with. Like, these are absolutely observations you can make, and you can repeat these observations. So if you measure that the candlestick is, the candelabra part is like 6 inches long, and it has the different striations and different things at different points, you can measure that on the body over and over again. That is the repeatable part. You may also, if it's in the conservatory, you may also predict that there will be possibly blood found there, and that the blood would, if you struck them with a candlestick at a certain point in their body, they would create certain bruises and or spatter patterns if it was in the head, for example. These are all things that you can scientifically determine about events that are not repeatable. These are predictions you can make. Again, if it's Mr. Green, you may predict that there is his fingerprints on the candlestick, and or his DNA found at the scene, or evidence that he was at least in the house and in the conservatory. These are all, you get the idea. These are all absolutely scientific predictions you can make about the past, about non-repeatable events. And the same thing is true with origins. We can make predictions if we want to say that all life has a common ancestor. There are certain predictions you can make. You can say, if you want to hypothesize about plate tectonics or the age of the Earth, you can make predictions and see if those predictions are found. That's the problem with creationism, is that it does not make unique predictions. There's no unique prediction that is made and found that has been determined and that has come true. So, for example, if you wanted to say that God uniquely created every kind of plant or animal, a unique prediction would actually be that there are certain kinds of animals that don't necessarily share any DNA with other creatures, right? Because God could create a special species of, say, even a platypus, right? Like, that's often a common example. It was so weird. Why does a platypus absolutely share the DNA that we would predict from the ancestors we would predict in the clades that they are in? Why are there not creatures that don't share? Like that would disprove evolution, right? If we suddenly found that a bunch of kinds don't share DNA. So it's creation science that fails the science test.
Saw it happen and you can't repeat the experiment. Anyway, if the Bible isn't true to the facts about the real world, about the age of the earth, and there's no reason for us then to really trust it to explain our everyday human experience, well, atheists and Bible skeptics realize this, and they say, well, many Christians are contradicting their own beliefs by questioning teachings in the Bible itself, especially.
This is not entirely wrong either. While millions of Christians are able to harmonize the science of old Earth and perhaps biological evolution, and they can reconcile that with what they read in the Bible, seems to me that is not the most natural, most honest way of reading these texts. Now, I'm not a scholar, I'm not an expert. It is not the reason why I am not a Christian. There's lots of other reasons, although it did prompt me on my journey to look. But I'm actually kind of with Calvin. If you are going to broadly just allegorize, for example, Genesis 1 and 2, to such an extent that it doesn't matter that the order of creation was wrong or that you have to accept all kinds of weird stories, that it's not meant to be taken literally, it's just meant to be taken allegorically, I feel like it is pretty easy then to start wondering, at what point do we stop allegorizing, and at what point do we stop taking these things as actual history? These are good questions to ask. And I think if you want to be a believer or not a believer, these are something you should wrestle with.
Genesis, and this is often used to attack the entire Christian faith. Look, I've dialogued with a lot of believers over the years at conferences and different events, etc., and I've experienced something repeatedly. The conversation usually looks, something like this. Well, look, I'm a Christian, but look, I'm a well-educated person, and I believe in science and millions of years and evolution, and I've got a couple of degrees, and I don't want my family and friends to think I'm some naive, unintelligent Christian, I mean, of course, Genesis is just mythological. Look, it's got a talking snake in it. Yeah, well, the problem with arguing this way is that if you look over here in the Bible, there's a talking donkey. And over here, there's a floating axe head. I mean, how's that experiment going for you? Do axe heads float? And over here, there's...
I mean, these are excellent points. And that is partially why I wonder why ministries like Young Earth Creation Ministries, like Answers in Genesis, bother at all to try to give the appearance that they are scientific. So Calvin was just complaining about someone he spoke to, or a stereotype of someone he spoke to, that they're Christians and they want to seem academic. Is not Answers in Genesis trying to take that Genesis 1 and 2 and make it seem academic? Why are you not just embracing that? If you're going to embrace miracles of talking donkeys or miracles of floating axe heads, why are you just not saying, look, Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is a miracle. We don't attempt to defend it. We don't attempt to explain it. This is all part of God's magic and how he works. Magic's probably not the best phrase. Like, why is, or on the flip side, why is then Answers in Genesis not writing articles about the science of talking donkeys and how, giving us demonstrations of how, it is possible with the larynx of a donkey that they can, and with the lips and all these things, why is it not scientifically plausible? Or with the serpent, why are we not giving us Answers in Genesis telling us the science about floating axe heads? Why, Calvin, are you selectively saying that's fine to be miracles over here, but Genesis 1 and 2 we need to try and defend? I put forth that it is you who are attempting to defend academic prowess, and that you are not silly believers who believe for bad reasons. Your whole ministry, your parent ministry, everything you're doing is all to make you Christians not look ridiculous and to feel like you can believe in 6,000 years old with some scientific backing. I think we're looking at projection here. What do you guys think?
It's a guy who walks on water and it's not even frozen, and Jesus is healing a crippled hand and a dead person comes back to life. I mean, which part of the Bible am I supposed to be embarrassed about as a Christian? You know, non-Christians are...
Yeah. Why is Answers in Genesis embarrassed about the flood and embarrassed about creation to the extent where they have to set up whole streaming services and $100 million attractions to try to just convince people that there are scientific reasons to do this stuff? Huh?
Often looking at believers like, well, why do you believe this part but not this part? Why do you hold to science that they think that's what it is here, but believe that dead people come back to life over here? Why so inconsistent in your thinking? Arguing that way signals to people that what scientists have determined about the past has more authority than what the words of Scripture do. And then why would we expect...
So we've already covered that, but natural revelation and direct revelation should be in harmony, and you don't take one over the other. I think most thoughtful Christians would agree that the God of the Bible, if the God of the Bible is correct, wouldn't lie to us in nature and by conflicting with things. So you absolutely need to take both and harmonize them. And if you can't, the only one we can actually test for its validity is the natural revelation. So if natural revelation conflicts with any reasonable interpretation of this scriptural revelation, guess what? The scriptural revelation has to lose, or it needs to be reinterpreted. That's just the reality here. So to deny reality to save your interpretation of a book is the silly position. Now I'm with you. That undermines the book. And so if you've decided, for the Bible tells me so, if that's the whole reason you believe anything and that's the way it exists, just stop defending it. Just embrace it all as talking donkeys.
anyone to take it as authoritative. So, why should the age of the earth even matter to Christians? Because trying to add millions of years into the Bible when it's clearly not there destroys the concept of biblical authority.
It doesn't destroy the concept of biblical authority, because obviously there are people who interpret the Bible and believe in it very much, and they believe the Bible is authoritative in their life, and the Bible is authoritative in that which it attempts to teach. What the people would say is that the Bible isn't attempting to teach us actually about origins or about science or about these kind of things. And so anyway, how do you guys reconcile this stuff? Was science, for those of you who no longer believe, was science a part of that journey for you? As it was the start for me. It was not the nail in the coffin, as it were. Or perhaps are you still a Christian? How do you reconcile conflicts between general revelation and direct revelation like the Bible? Or maybe you don't. Maybe you agree that the Bible, there are different magistrates and that the Bible is not attempting to teach at all about science. Let me know in the comments. Let me know in the chat. Or let me know in the super chat. That'd be great too. All right. That was Calvin Smith of Answers in Genesis. Back to the videos. Next up, we have Tim from Red Pen Logic.
Christianity is not a religion. It's a relationship with God. Oh, really? So what's God's favorite color? Well, I don't really know. Does God have a favorite movie? What about pets? Does God have any pets? I think dogs go to heaven. He's got a sports guy. Does he like football, basketball, hockey? I don't really know. So you're telling me you have an intimate and personal relationship with God who knows everything about you, knows all of your thoughts, and you don't even know what his favorite color is? But he loves me. Yeah, and you don't know anything about him.
Hello?
Hey, Dad, I have a question for you.
Okay.
What's your favorite color?
Oh, what's this about?
Well, I'm just wondering, I'm actually worried we don't have a good relationship if I don't know your favorite color. You mind if I take a guess?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, your favorite color's green.
No, it's blue.
Oh, no. Okay.
Oh, I still love you anyway, Tim.
Okay, thanks, Dad. Gotta go. This video has 3.
All right. Before we get into that, obviously he was looking at a TikTok video, which then we're like third hand watching the TikTok video, which is fun. And then Tim decided to call his father and ask, what his father's favorite color was. The video posited that if Christians are indeed in a relationship with God, that there are some basic questions. But, if you're in a relationship with someone, there are things that you learn about that person if it's two-way. One of the things I was wondering as I was watching this, and we'll get to it at the end, but I'll mention it now. I actually wonder if it's actually the opposite of what's going to be happening here, and that our relationship with God is actually parasocial, where we think we know things about God because we are reading about God or watching God or hearing sermons about God, all those kind of things. Does God actually know anything about us, though? God being the celebrity in this parasocial relationship. That all aside, actually, let me know. What do you think? Is there anything to that? Maybe are people having a parasocial relationship with God? We'll leave that for now, because in the video we're talking now about the opposite, where God knows everything about us, and we're just granting that for some reason. Now, and we're looking at whether we know anything about God, be it the favorite color or something like that.
Big problems. Let's look at each together. First, just because you don't know some trivial things about God, like his favorite color or movie, doesn't mean you don't have a relationship with him.
Now, this is obviously trivially true, right? So, everyone's probably seen some version of a dating game, for example, where people are in romantic relationships or friendship relationships or something like that, or even, parent-child, that kind of thing. You go on a show and they ask one person a question, and then the second person comes in and they're supposed to predict how the other person would have responded. There's lots of times in these things where it actually reveals that people who are in obvious relationships with each other don't always know all the little details about these kind of things. Fine, well and good. What the point of the TikTok is that if you think you're in this relationship, do you know anything about them? It's not like there was these 3 magical questions like favorite movie, favorite sports team, favorite color. That's the key. It's really, do you know anything? Now, the first thing you would ask, so let's say you were in a situation where someone's talking about their girlfriend from Canada. Now, in Canada, that wasn't a thing, but it's my understanding that in the States, it's a trope that, you might claim that you had a significant other in Canada and that's how come your friends haven't met them. You would ask questions like, well, how tall are they? What's their hair color? What's their skin color? You might ask some things about their physical attributes. I applaud the TikTok maker for not making that mistakes, because the Christians then can immediately jump on some kind of fallacy saying it's a category error, that, well, because God doesn't have a body, that obviously we can't know about God's physical attributes. So congrats to the TikTok for not falling into that trap that the Christians can then easily dismiss. But if you don't know anything, if you don't know, well, in the case of the girlfriend, for example, you would expect to know those physical traits, but you'd also expect to know what city do they live in, what school do they go to, what's their last name. You'd expect to have at least some details. The TikTok video points out that if a Christian really wants to look at it, what details about God do they know? Is this really a relationship, or are you just projecting things? If it's a two-way street, if it's actually a relationship, how come there aren't these categories of these facts that you can tell me, you can describe God to me in some way, some detail, some fact about a person? It's got to be some kind of red flag if you can't describe anything about the person you're in a relationship with, or the being you're in a relationship with.
Video is a non sequitur. That means it just doesn't follow. Think about the relationship Navy SEALs have towards each other. These men are willing to die for each other. Now, do they know each other's favorite color? Well, not likely. But that doesn't mean they don't have a deep and profound relationship. That's because
Now, a Navy SEAL team, for example, they might actually, it's true, you may not, the individual Navy SEALs may have just met each other recently, and or when they're in training, they don't have a lot of time to talk about their personal lives, and that may not be an appropriate thing to talk about. What creates the bond of loyalty, though, between in a Navy SEAL team is a lot of times it's shared experiences is what creates those bonds in any kind of military outfit. The fact that you've been through the same thing that the person next to you has been through, be it the training or be it an attack or something that happened on the travel, like shared experiences actually do create stronger bonds than knowledge about trivia about a person, for sure. So that is actually one of the reasons why military people are so willing to lay down their lives for each other, but also part of it is a code that is a code that is trained into them, because if you will have your brother or sister's back in these cases, because they will also have yours, and it's this whole shared bond. So I do like the example of the Navy SEALs because, again, the personal, the color of their first bicycle probably doesn't come up in those kind of deep trainings. They have other reasons, and they also, of course, know that the person next to them exists. This is not in question, and you can tell things about them. They will know how tall are they, what color is their skin, what color is their hair, which bunk do they sleep in, what's their dog tag number, all these kind of things. And a lot of times they'll know where they're from a lot of times, or at least what their last name is. So again, that's all in the category of things about God. So Tim is taking this too literally, saying that these 3 trivia questions are the test about a relationship. No, it's that, can you know anything? Do you know any details? And again, what are these shared experiences that we have with God? We think that we have shared experiences with God, or at least I did. I thought God was with me at my baptism. I thought God was with me when I was in near misses on the road. I thought God was with me looking for my contact lens on the floor. These are things that I thought were shared experiences with God and were part of why I thought I had a relationship with Him. But when you separate it out, and when I looked at it carefully in hindsight, which of those things, what was I attributing that closeness to? Is there actually something other than my mind that was there? For me, I decided that there actually, all those experiences that I thought I was attributing to God were not true. But that's not relevant to Tim right now. Anyway, let's see what else he has to say.
deep relationships don't trade in trivialities. They're based on something else. Second, just because you don't know some trivial things about God doesn't mean you don't know anything about God.
What things about God would be trivial? So I guess if you knew like God's favorite color or God's maybe favorite denomination or favorite preacher, those would be cool things. Favorite religion, those would be interesting things to know. Anyway, Tim, what do we know about God, and how do we know it? What is your definition of knowledge?
Here's what I do know about God. I know He's morally perfect, exceeding.
Tim claims to know that God is morally perfect. How do you know that? Is it because the Bible tells you so? What if, is it not plausible? Is it not possible that an imperfect being claimed to be perfect? And or, by what definition of morality are you claiming is morally perfect? So, if you go by my definition, that morality has to do with reducing harm and increasing flourishing, then I think you can show places where God, at least in the Bible, doesn't always reduce harm and increase flourishing. However, if your definition of God is morality is what God says, then you've got a tautology. Then, of course, God is morally perfect because you've defined morality as what God does, and you've proven literally nothing. So tell me, how do you know that God is morally perfect?
Merciful, abounding in steadfast love. I know he's someone worthy of our.
How do you know that God loves you? Again, but if you, you might ask, well, how do I know that my mother loves me, or that anyone loves you, or that your dog loves you? These again are shown either through actions, they do loving things, and perhaps you might combine that with that they profess love. Cool. What loving thing can you demonstrate that God actually has done that is undeniably from God? If I'm claiming to know this, right? Justified true belief. And how can I know that God is professing to love me? These are all in the category of things that you can't know, or at least let me know how you know.
Worship and obedience. I know he's given me something more valuable than anything imaginable. Forgiveness.
Okay. I pause a little quick there. Forgiveness. God has given him something that's apparently valuable, for forgiveness. How do you know that God has forgiven you? Not everyone who says to me, on that day, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. The Bible warns that there are people who are convinced that they are saved, who on Judgment Day will find out then and there that they were not saved. How do you know that you are not one of the people that the Bible predicts will be completely convinced? You are completely convinced, but the Bible already tells us that you can't know this. You might be one of the people who's not saved.
So no, I don't know God's favorite color or movie or number, but I do know something.
I think God's favorite number is either 7 or 40. Just putting it out there. I'm guessing it's one of those.
Things that are much more profound than that. Third, this video seems to confuse propositional knowledge and what we might call experiential knowledge. For example, this is the difference between reading about a sunset in a textbook and experiencing one firsthand. Notice what happened in the video. The Christian claims to have a relationship with God, and then the atheist responds by quizzing the Christian on trivial facts about God. How could
But if you're trying to compare experiencing a sunset with books, with merely the only experience you have with sunset is by reading about it in a book, for example, or maybe it is you're talking to an unsighted individual who has never seen a sunset. Pardon me. Again, who would only have a chance to read about it or to hear about it described to them. You would still be able to, in order to determine whether someone's experience of the sunset was equivalent to your experience of the sunset, at least ask questions about it. What did you see? What colors did you see? How did the sky change throughout the process? And you can also then compare, how did it make you feel? And these are things that you actually can ask questions about. Just because something you've learned experientially doesn't mean there are not questions that can be asked and things that can be learned and propositional knowledge about that experience. So the person making the TikTok video wasn't saying that your relationship with God would be purely propositional. They were just posing the very valid question, why can't you tell me anything propositional?
a Christian have a relationship with God if they don't even know his favorite color? Granted, I think we should have propositional knowledge about God because it strengthens our relationship.
So do I. So tell me how you or anyone has this propositional knowledge. As far as I can tell, if you're like William Lane Craig or anybody, all you have is this experiential. The burning in the bosom. If you're a Mormon, these are the kind of these experiences need to lead to something propositional. If you want someone like me to think that you're not just talking to yourself.
A book to help you with that is The Knowledge of the Holy by A.W. Tozer. Having said that, relationships don't demand exhaustive propositional knowledge. Pet lovers might appreciate this. My wife and kids have a relationship of sorts with our dog, Polly. Say hi, Polly. Now we could ask,
Polly.
What's Polly's favorite color? Well, beats me, but we're still best friends, aren't we, Polly? Yeah. By the way, Polly does.
I mean, this is a weird example because, of course, while I am a dog lover and think that dogs do experience some emotions, to some extent, we do know that dogs are pack animals, and the behaviors that they exhibit that we anthropomorphize as love are partially for just them doing their own survival behavior and making sure they get food. And, dogs have been bred to have certain characteristics and traits, some of which that have been selected for are, of course, loving and being cuddly and being cute. So, yeah, that we would purely call this that we would purely call this a loving relationship is a whole thing. I don't think anyone would deny that dogs and their owners do have relationships, but this idea that because we don't know the dog's favorite color, we don't have a relationship is, again, just category error. If we want to claim we have a relationship with our dog, first of all, we understand certain things. So if you can't tell me the breed of dog or perhaps the types of breeds, although some people can't know what their breeds are, you'd know roughly the height of your dog. You would know a name that the dog responds to. You would know its size, its color. You would know some basic proposition, what kind of food it likes. You would know some propositional things about your dog. Similarly, and we'll get to this in a sec,
Doesn't know my favorite color either. Yet if you come to the door, she will cower in fear. But when I go to the door, she wags her tail in excitement. Right, Polly?
yeah, the dog is excited about you, the owner, because the dog has some propositional knowledge about you. Probably the dog knows what you smell like. That's probably the main thing. The dog also will have some limited remembrance of kind of things that you have done for the dog in the past. It will know roughly what you look like. Actually, it reminds me, just to step back, it just occurred to me, he said we don't know what the dog's favorite color is. I don't know, let me know in the chat. Do dogs actually see in color? Is that a myth? I think dogs only see in black and white, so asking what a dog's favorite color is, I just realized, is probably a ridiculous question on that front. Or is that a myth? I'm never completely sure on that, or if dogs... There's lots of things about dogs I'm not sure about, but that might be a ridiculous question. I've derailed myself. I'm sorry. But all that to know, dogs absolutely have some propositional knowledge of their owners. They can't express it verbally, but they do express it by wagging their tail and showing affection, these kind of things. Anyway.
That's because she knows me and not you. If you don't like the pet illustration, then think about the relationship between a mother and her baby. The point is, this...
Same thing, mother and a baby. Yeah, that's obviously a very intimate bond that is accentuated for a birth mother, because a birth mother would have, they would have had even more time to bond and to share some of the same sounds and experiences and get to know each other more familiarly. Again, that baby knows sounds of voices and smells, and very early on in an infant's life, the facial recognition kicks in. These are all, while a baby can't express what these details are yet, they absolutely have propositional knowledge of the mother, and of course the mother presumably has some propositional knowledge of their infant as well. So again, bad example, not analogous.
Oh, you can't name God's favorite color, therefore you don't have a relationship with him, absolutely fails.
So, while it is trivially true that the trifecta questions What's God's favorite color? What's God's favorite number? What's God's favorite sports team? That is not a test of whether or not you have a relationship with someone, but the test is some level of propositional knowledge. I give kudos to the TikTok maker for giving a good example of that. Tim, I think that your defenses of not having propositional knowledge and your claims of the propositional knowledge you think you do have completely failed. And I wish I had brought a cup to throw a pencil in so that I could also, instead of dropping the mic, apparently he slams the pen into the cup. But let me know in the comments. Am I being too hard on this? Do people have actual propositional knowledge of God? Knowledge in the sense of justified true belief? Or should we know God's favorite color? More importantly, I'm actually now thinking about this question of, do what Christians or other people think that the relationship they think that they have with God, is that more akin to a parasocial relationship? Should we actually instead ask for proof that the God, rather than asking what we know about God, what evidence is there that God knows anything at all about me? The Bible says it knows the number of hairs on my head. How do we know that? Does God know my name? Does not God know anything about me? How would I know? How can we test this? I think maybe we're onto something. Let me know if I'm off base or if I've discovered some interesting thing. All right, moving on. Many of you, if you watch my channel regularly, may know that for me, the most convincing reason why I personally do not believe in gods, or at least I do not believe in a loving God who wants to have a relationship with me. You could convince me of a deity, perhaps, and a deistic, uncaring creator, perhaps, maybe, whatever. But this notion of a loving God who wants to have a relationship with me, I am unconvinced of this. The nail in the coffin for me is the divine hiddenness argument. Now, I don't think the divine hiddenness argument can mean anything to anyone other than myself, because the divine hiddenness argument requires a non-resistant non-believer. And only I can know if I am non-resistant. Now, and that's actually even more tricky because I can't actually know that I'm non-resistant. All I can do is evaluate as best as I possibly can my own motives, my own biases, all these kind of things to tell if I am non-resistant to the Bible. I actually have created a few videos on this topic. Let me throw up, wrong one, wrong tab. All right, a couple of videos on this topic: divine hiddenness, inspiring philosophy response, and if God exists, he wouldn't be hidden. These are two videos I made several years ago that I think I do still recommend on the topic if you're interested. But today I want to look at a visit that a couple of YouTubers made to Frank Turek. And on his podcast, he had a couple of guests on, the first of which is Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy. And they wanted to talk about a little bit more about divine hiddenness. So let's see what they had to say.
Welcome to the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist bonus podcast. I'm with Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy. If you don't know about Inspiring Philosophy, you can just go check it out on YouTube. Got some great stuff up there. Mike has his master's degree from the University of Arizona.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
And you live in Tucson, don't you?
I do, yeah.
Okay. We're here at ETS, the Evangelical
They have propositional knowledge of each other. That's cool.
Theological Society. And Mike has some great videos on many topics on YouTube. And I want to talk about one of them, Mike, that's been a perennial question. There are two big questions, I think, two big objections atheists bring up against Christianity. Well, more, but two of the biggest one has to do with the problem of evil, and the other has to do with the problem of the so-called hiddenness of God. You know, why isn't God more obvious? Why do we need apologists at all? What is this all about? Now, you put together a great video, I think, on this. Well, first of all, why did you do that? And was that an issue for you, or did you see atheists or non-believers bringing that up as an objection?
Yeah, I see atheists or non-believers bring it up, and so I wanted to do a video addressing it. So I was doing...
So to be fair, this video is quite old of Mike, the one that they're talking about, his video, which I responded to. That was before Mike or I knew each other in any sense. We've spoken face to face via calls, and we've interacted on social media and that kind of thing. But this was all before that, so I'm not in any way. He didn't make this video in response to me. This was something that he had observed in his career and in his life. But though it is something that I responded to, because actually his video for me was part of my evaluation as to whether this was a good argument for myself. I watched his video and decided that it wasn't a great argument, but this is what they're talking about today. I'm not sure why Frank is all of a sudden, years later, talking about this on his latest podcast, but so be it.
A series where I was addressing objections from atheists, like problem of evil, problem of an evil God, and I also did divine hiddenness when I did that.
I think those of you who follow my channel for a while will also know that for me, problem of evil is not actually that compelling. I know that for many former believers that the problem of evil is the number one thing. I understand why, but for me, it's not huge. For me, divine hiddenness is the big one. And everyone's different about what convinces or unconvinces them.
Okay, so what is the real reason, or what are some of the potential reasons that God isn't as obvious as we would like him to be? I mean, even Isaiah says, you're a God that hides yourself. Mm-hmm. Why is he hiding? What's it?
Very briefly, in case you're not familiar with divine hiddenness as a general category, the idea is that if there is a loving God who wants to have a relationship with me, if I am not able to be convinced, or if I'm not convinced as a genuine seeker who's not suppressing any kind of truth, cannot come to the conclusion that God exists, therefore that is a prerequisite for me having this loving relationship with them. You can't have a loving relationship with someone you don't intellectually assent to their existence. Then, and if there are consequences, negative consequences to this loving relationship not happening, that being who doesn't reveal themselves sufficiently can't be actually loving, or at least isn't loving to that person, because that all-powerful being would absolutely be able to convince anyone that they wanted to that they exist. So again, for an individual who is able to evaluate for themselves whether or not they're non-resistant, that if they can confidently come to that conclusion, then they're justified in saying, well, there must not be a loving being who wants to have a relationship with me, at least at this time. Otherwise, that being could easily reveal himself. So, for example, Saul of Tarsus, Paul, the Apostle Paul, he received a revelation. Many people in the Bible, receive revelations. Now, I'm not necessarily asking for this, but everyone who became a believer did receive enough information to accept that the God exists. So this is at least in the realm of possible for God to do for each person. That's it in a nutshell. Carry on with Mike.
Deal.
Well, I mean, there's multiple ways we can look at this. It has more to do with us, in my view. This is also the view of philosophers like Paul Moser, who talk about how humanity is currently in our state that we Christians believe is sinful. If God were to make himself just blatantly obvious, like show up in the sky, that's going to affect our process of sanctification, of us coming to him lovingly. So Paul Moser sets up this thing. It's
if God just straight up reveals himself, the argument here is going to be that that affects whether or not I will love him. The problem is, for someone like me, I cannot enter a loving relationship with a being that I'm not convinced exists. So, it doesn't actually matter that this revelation of God to me, that I might twist it, or that it may not actually result in me being loving. In order for me to actually have a chance to love God, I will never have a chance to reject God until such time as he convinces me that he exists. So if he's not going to show me, I just never had that chance to reject him. Now, we're going to talk about this in one of the videos coming down the line here that we're responding to. But I just don't have a chance. To this point in time in my life, I cannot choose to accept or reject God because I'm not convinced he exists. This should be plainly obvious. And so, again, this objection seems silly, Michael.
So what does God want? Okay, he is this all-powerful God that could snap his fingers and take everything out of existence if he wanted to. And you're dealing with humanity, which is quite sinful, quite selfish. So Moser says, what does God want? Well, he wants us to love him for who he is.
God wants us to love him for who he is. How can I know what he is? How can I choose to love him if I'm not convinced of him? There is a step 1 and a step 2. The fact that my step 2 might have some new challenges in some way that about this doesn't stop the fact that step 1 has to happen. God absolutely reveals himself to some people and to some beings. All the demons, all the angels completely know that God exists, and they still, some of them accept and love God, some of them reject God. But they've all had equal opportunity of knowing that he exists. I and many other non-resistant non-believers do not have this opportunity.
To truly follow him, love him, not so that we could get something from him, but just because we would love him. And so he says God would want cognitively robust theism.
What would be what would be non-cognitively robust about a faith where God reveals himself? So are you going to tell me that Paul the Apostle didn't have a cognitively robust faith, or Moses, who received the burning bush revelation, he didn't have a cognitively robust faith? Like, there's nothing about more evidence that precludes me from falling in love with the God who I then become exists. Now, if the only way that would happen is if God reveals his true character to me, and that is not a character that I will love for some reason. So if he's a jerk, if he's unloving, like if this God is perfect and all loving the way you suggest, there's nothing he should be able to reveal himself about me, or reveal about himself to me, that would preclude me from loving him. In fact, it just gives me a more informed choice. What you want me to have is a less informed choice.
Where we follow God, we love him, and we truly want to get to know him more. And that's better than just basic theism. So the way
it's better, yeah. If this whole theodicy is if I'm going to buy into what you're talking about, yes, it is better to have this relationship, to love the God, than just intellectual assent to the God. But the intellectual assent has to happen, or I never have a choice for the second part.
That Moser sets this out.
I'm sorry, this is going to get repetitive, but it's frustrating.
He says the way that God would want to get us there is he would have to be a little bit hidden, reveal himself in slow steps so we get to learn him better. Because if
God just revealed his full glory to me, there's some point at which apparently if it's too much all at once that I won't love him. I guess that happens with humans. Maybe there's someone who, if you got to know them over time, slowly, that you would love them more than if they gave us the full truth about them all at once. Fine. But God knows that. God knows the rate that the steps which he could reveal himself to me. He's all-knowing, right? So these are all steps he could do. But that doesn't negate the fact that he needs to do them in order for me to have this choice or the opportunity to fall in love with him.
God shows up and he sees it, For one, that could possibly, and for some people, create fear. People are just going to worship him out of fear. I've even heard some atheists say that, if eternal conscious torment is true, they would worship God out of fear so they could avoid hell. Well, that's
Yeah, I have said that. Absolutely. Because that's the pragmatic thing to do, right? But that actually, what does it matter? Let's look at the theology here. So if, again, this is the fire insurance trying to stay out of hell, if I'm not convinced that God exists, I'm still going to hell. If I have bad motives for worshiping God, I'm also going to hell. So I'm no worse off. At least I'm making an informed choice. There's nothing about my life has gotten worse by more knowledge about God. Yes, I might screw up the relationship part. But again, God could do it and not make my life worse. So unless you can identify for me the way that this makes my life worse, you haven't solved the problem. You've just come up with excuses. Not even good ones.
not really loving God. That's not really following him and having a relationship with him, getting to know him.
That's just fire insurance.
It's fire insurance, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a selfish it's a selfish way to be in a relationship with God.
That's fine, because again, at least I would have made that choice as an informed choice. I would have known that God exists. Like, is the problem here that I might actually inadvertently properly love him and have this relationship that he wants? Because I don't see how me disbelieving in God and me worshiping God with bad motives, if there's any differentiation between those two things. Let me know in the comments. Am I crazy about that?
It's not what God is interested in. So we need to think about what it would be like, because we are on a different ontological level than God. It's not like he can show up as just a regular guy. Now, when he did that in the New Testament, what happened? Well, they killed.
That's funny, because it's not like God could just show up as a regular guy. But when he did that, so obviously he could, right? And even in the New Testament, they have little parables and stories about where whatever you're giving to the least of these, that you're actually doing unto God. And a lot of people, they tell these stories about, the hitchhiker that you picked up, or the widow that you fed, or whatever, that actually was Jesus in disguise. Those are regular Christian things to talk about. So Jesus can show up. At least there are theologies where that is totally acceptable thing for him to do. He doesn't have to show up in the sky, lightning bolts ablazing, as it were. Although he could. God could give the entire world certainty that he exists, and we know that some people would still reject him, and some people would accept him. At least everyone would have an informed choice. Right now, my argument is that myself and others cannot make an informed choice to love God or not.
Killed him.
Right, we killed him. Yeah.
So
here I am.
Yeah.
You must die. God, where are you? Here I am. You must die.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
And even the Pharisees accused him of working with the devil. So God shows up, does miracles.
Does that not just reinforce the idea that God can give some people absolute assurance that he exists, and their free will is still intact? Their ability to accept or reject is not hampered by this knowledge. So why not give it?
Some people wanted to make him king, use him for selfish reasons. Many wanted to kill him because they were taking away his power. So when God would reveal himself to humanity, it always brought out some of the worst traits in humanity.
No, it didn't always bring out the worst traits in humanity, unless you're trying to tell me that the disciples and people who met Jesus, his followers, the people who were fed at who listened to the Sermon on the Mount, that those people all were worse off having met Jesus than not. You can't tell me that it, as 100% of the time, a negative thing, at least not in your story. And so what if the percentage is low about the people who react to this knowledge in the way that God wants, is it lower than if he doesn't give sufficient evidence? It can't. Just definitionally, it can't. So, yeah, your argument here again doesn't work.
The biblical text, as we can see. So we need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about the hiddenness of God.
Yeah, that's a good insight. And
No.
I think maybe we ought to just back up a second and ask ourselves, what is the real purpose of life? Is the purpose of life just to intellectually know that God exists? Well, no. Even the demons know that, right?
Exactly. Thank you. The demons have full intellectual knowledge that God exists, and yet they don't worship him.
Purpose of life is to know God in a relational way, and as the scriptures say, to be conformed to the image of his son. So you had mentioned sanctification before.
Yeah, but can you love someone that you don't think they exist? Again, sorry to beat this drum over and over. I'm a resounding gong clanging cymbal here. You gotta believe that God exists before you can love him. And if I can't believe that God exists, or if I'm unconvinced that God exists, I can't love him. There's step one and there's step two. You cannot talk about how my reaction may be impacted if we're never getting past step one. At least not. Maybe later we'll talk about a little bit about Molinism, and we'll see how that goes.
How are we best sanctified? How does God get his purposes done with free creatures? Is it to reveal himself in an overt way routinely, or is it the way he appears to be doing it now?
Right. And one thing to say about that is,
I mean, what you're doing now seems like a low percentage play.
God is omniscient. He knows the best way, and he knows he can sanctify us without necessarily showing up in a room right now. I ask atheists occasionally, what would happen if Zeus appeared? Like for us in this room, what if Zeus appeared right in this room right now?
Right.
We'd be like,
I would have intellectual assent that Zeus exists. I mean, assuming that the appearance, I'm just going to grant here that the appearance can be externally confirmed, and I can affirm for myself at least that I'm not hallucinating, and that there's something. If this is a verifiable, genuine appearance of Zeus that that we can scientifically assure ourselves that was a genuine appearance of Zeus, I would have full intellectual assent, and my life would go on.
oh, Zeus exists. Anyway, we're not going to worship him. We're not going to be like, oh, we love you. We totally are your followers now. That's not how it works.
But I might. Right now, the chance of me falling in love with Zeus is 0%. And even if after that appearance by Zeus, it's only 0.01%, at least there's a chance at that point. It's a prerequisite. If Zeus wants to have a relationship with us, that's his first step. So no, but we're not arguing. The divine hiddenness argument isn't saying that everyone will accept him with sufficient knowledge. It is asking, why are there non-resistant non-believers who are seeking God, who for whatever reason cannot be convinced?
Now you have the God of the Bible, who is all-knowing. He knows how to sanctify his creatures in the best way possible. And he can definitely sanctify us without showing up physically.
Of course, this is just begging the question. You're saying that the God you are unconvinced of knows what's best for you, and what's best for you is not knowing. Okay, that's just forever. You got to understand that that's forever going to be unsatisfactory, right? Like someone like me will never nod my head and say, "Oh yeah, right." So you got me there. No, that's maybe if I'm convinced God knows everything, then I would find that answer satisfactory. But I don't.
They're seeing us being seen right before our eyes. So why does he need to do that if he can sanctify those who will freely choose to love him without showing up in this life for everyone to see physically?
Aha. A couple things there. One, I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that God needs to show up physically. Like there's there's ways for God to convince me that he exists that don't necessarily have to infringe on other people, and that, or also that don't have to be special one-time things for me. There, an all-knowing God would know what is going to convince the maximum number of people, or at least convince me. What Mike just said there, though, which kind of went over quick, is that those who would accept him, he will reveal himself to. So now he's buying into a kind of a worldview where God knows that I'm supposed to assume, I'm supposed to accept that I would not accept God no matter how much evidence I'm given, that are at least not in a way that is a loving relationship, the kind that he wants. Again, not satisfactory, because how can I know that? Maybe that, that could be entirely true. Let's say hypothetically, makes sense, totally true. It's still not going to be satisfying to someone like me, right? And it's obviously not an argument for me to believe that God is going to exist. You say, well, okay, you're going to reject him, so he will never convince you. Okay, I will never be convinced. Cool. Then what are you arguing with? What are you giving us arguments for? If God will reveal himself sufficiently to everyone who would choose him, what's apologetics for? Why is Ray Comfort handing out pamphlets? Why any of this? Now you may say, okay, well, God, that's the tool God is choosing to use. Sure, but if Michael Jones is supposed to be the instrument by which, a person X who would accept God under the right circumstances would accept him, Michael could still not do it, and God would then find another way to do it. So I don't get it. I don't get it. If these divine hiddenness arguments follow, apologetics shouldn't exist, shouldn't need to exist.
So if God is omniscient, he knows what he's doing at the end of the day.
Now, I know some atheists
Unsatisfying.
have said that I'm not resistant to God, and I'm seeking God, so why can't I find him? Non-resistant non-belief, I think, is the way they put it, right, Mike? Is that
Right.
fair to say? So, and is this the Schnellenberg argument, where he's trying to say, I can't remember what's his first name. Why is it?
So first of all, it's Schellenberg. So if you are a Mennonite like me, Schellenberg is at least the common name in my Mennonite circles. So it's not Schnellenberg. Schellenberg. And yeah, he doesn't remember the first name. The first name is John L. Schellenberg. He goes and publishes under J.L. Schellenberg. So just if you're ever looking up good arguments and good definitions of the divine hiddenness argument, J.L. Schellenberg is the person you want to check out.
Escaping me, Schnellenberg's first name.
I can't remember.
I can't remember. He's a philosopher who tries to say that
Canadian
the hiddenness of God is a problem, and if God truly loves us, easy for me to say, loves us, and he wants us to be in fellowship with him. Why are there people who want to know him but don't know him? So how would you respond to that?
So my first response is to quote.
So before we get into quoting C.S. Lewis, I was a believer. I set out to prove for myself. I didn't feel like, I felt like I knew God and that I was fully convinced that God existed. I wanted to go and get some answers to some questions. Every fiber of my being wanted to continue to believe in God. I believe that every human can know the content of their own thoughts. That really it's the only thing we can know. We can't know whether our thoughts are accurate, but if we can't know the content of our own thoughts, then just all is lost, right? I can know that the content of my thoughts was an insane desire, a desperation to believe that God existed. So all these brushes, they're about all these psychological notions that they're about to put forth, I can know for myself, at least in the era where I was doing this searching, were not true of me. I desperately wanted God to exist.
C.S. Lewis, he says in his paper, Man or Rabbit, honest rejection of Christ, however wrong, shall be forgiven and healed. Now, we
I don't know if you heard that quote. I hope you did. Quote from C.S. Lewis, honest rejection will be forgiven. I don't know. I spent a little bit of time today actually looking for what C.S. Lewis bases that on. No theology that I'm familiar with tells me that God is going to forgive honest disbelief. If there's a verse for me, I've seen Luke 10:12. To me, that's not a convincing proof. Let me know in the comments if you're a Christian, or if you're a C.S. Lewis fan, or if Mike, you're ever watching this. On what does C.S. Lewis base that assertion, or is that just what makes C.S. Lewis feel good about heaven? Because from the Bible I read, unless you accept Jesus, it doesn't matter whether it was honest or dishonest, you're not getting into heaven.
need to ask ourselves, without psychoanalyzing an individual, do those type of people exist? And I am skeptical those people even exist. And this has been shown in psychological study after study.
So the kind of person that I claim that I am, the kind of person who I have spent a significant amount of time of introspection to test myself as to whether I am such a person, Michael dismisses the entire category of non-resistant non-believers as that they don't exist. That there's no such person on the planet who would accept Jesus, who dies before accepting them. Bold claim. What is the evidence for this?
There's one, the title of a study called Wishful Thinking, and they asked parents, two groups of parents. Before they went into the study, one group of parents preferred daycare, one preferred home care. Then they gave...
Hold on. Just before... So, two sets of parents in this study. One prefers homeschool. One prefers daycare. Where was the group that prefers neither? That is seeking... who is neutral on the topic in advance and is looking at the research on this without a decision already made. I know that there are parents who are torn between homeschooling and not homeschooling, don't actually have a preference yet, especially brand new parents who are looking for information. Where is this study representing those? Because that's the non-resistant non-believer, not people who are committed to homeschool or committed to public school.
Each of these groups papers that confirm their beliefs, and then they gave them a paper that confirmed the other belief. Everyone who preferred home care came up with excuses to dismiss the daycare paper, and vice versa. There's another study that was...
Here's the other problem with this study. Daycare versus homeschooling is not there's so much personal preference in it because there's no objective score saying one is better than the other at all things. This is actually a value judgment. So someone who values public school may well value that some of the social aspects of school, they may value that ahead of the academic. They may value opportunities that students have for diversity of instruction and diversity of friendships. Though that may be actual value that the parent has, in which case the paper presenting them with academic, let's pretend we can say that the homeschool people score better on certain tests or whatever. That's not going to be convincing to a parent for whom that's not the value. Flip side, the people who prefer homeschool, they may not care about diversity of instruction or diversity of relationship or some of the social aspects. What they may value is making sure that the belief system is never contradicted, or they may they may value that one-on-one time with their child ahead of having other things to do outside of the home. These are not apples to apples comparisons. It's not like saying these are being unconvinced of one is just more shows you more about their values, not about whether they are able to objectively, rationally make a choice between one thing or another. Mike, this is a terrible study
done many decades ago called the Robbers Cave experiment, where boys were taken and they were on this campsite and they were sent to different tribes and they were having compete with one another. They were asked to do this task of collecting beans on the ground. And they always, when they were shown the piles of beans at the end, they always would say, our pile is bigger, obviously. Unbeknownst to them, they were not being shown the beans they collected. They were being shown an image of equal beans in both.
Again, not analogous. So what you're telling me is that, so there's groups of boys being shown, here's your bean pile, here's your competitor's bean pile. Yes, the number of beans is an objective thing that can be tested, but how many of us can accurately guess the number of beans in a pile? Not many of us can look at a picture and tell us the number of beans. So absent that, then the fact that you would have hope and confidence that your team was better than the other team, and of course there's a whole us versus them dynamic, sure, but us versus them doesn't tell me that if you instead put up a count of the beans and you said, well, this team had 20 beans and this one had 18, here's the actual count, which one do you think is the winner? And then people are, oh, well, we had the smaller number, but we still won. No, that's not what's happening here. And that's what someone like me is looking for in a God. What is something non-ambiguous, or at least less ambiguous than a pile of beans that convince me that God exists? So let's say I'm going to say that I will believe in God at such a time where the evidence convinces me, where the evidence is better for it than against. And that if I'm assuming that the neutral position, that the person who makes the positive claim that there is a God has a burden of proof, then yeah, my neutral position is I won't accept God until there's positive proof. So that's not an unreasonable, doesn't mean I have bias. It just means that, until there's that evidence. So this, again, both of these studies, at least as you presented them briefly here, maybe there's nuance that I don't understand. I think that you presented these in your video and that I talked about them. These are not analogous at all, and tell me nothing about, if you think that these are evidence for against the existence of non-resistant non-believers, we need to talk.
So they were shown two piles of equal beans, but they both were, out of their desire to be the winner, were picking theirs and saying, nope, there's clearly more beans in our pile. Mm-hmm. The truth is, humans are not reason machines.
Humans are also not bean counting machines.
We are all emotional. Mm-hmm. We all have reason and emotion to go into our beliefs. So,
yes, that is true. So, but again, there is, for a true proposition, for any given true proposition, there is a level of evidence that will eventually convince non-resistant people. So, or even resistant people. So, example I like to give is one's spouse or partner. Let's say that I live my life, or not me, but like a person is living their life assuming that their partner / spouse is faithful to them. And if you came up to them and said your partner is being unfaithful to you, they may be so confident that that is false that they would fight you about it, and that that is just not even in the realm of consideration for that person. But if that same person was to walk in to a room and witness their spouse being unfaithful, despite all the psychological priming and resistance to that belief, there would now be sufficient evidence that virtually everyone would then acknowledge, I did not want this fact about my unfaithful spouse to be true, but indeed there's sufficient evidence for me to believe it's true. Of course, it doesn't even, some people would be convinced, even though they were resistant to the idea, with less evidence of that. There might be text messages or other things. Again, there is always, or there is at least hypothetically, enough evidence to convince someone who is resistant to idea. If this was not the case, then you wouldn't get stories like J. Warner Wallace or Lee Strobel, who claim that they were resistant to Christianity, or Saul of Tarsus. All these people who, you have testimony after testimony of people who were resistant to Christianity and God. So those are actually resistant non-believers, and yet something overcame that level of resistance. So this idea that Mike's putting forth now that, well, there's no amount of evidence that'll convince everyone. Sure, maybe. But there are increasing levels of the more evidence that exists, there will be more people. Does it cast a broader net of people who will become convinced, whether they are resistant or not? Don't like this argument.
For someone to say if you just gave me the evidence, I would believe. That's just not how humans work.
It depends on this. That all ties into this whole discussion I just had. Not every piece of evidence is created equal. Not every piece of evidence is be equally convincing to one person as to the next person. Trivially true. Absolutely. But there is a level of evidence that even the most resistant person will ultimately accept. All right, I'm going to get into fringe here. That rational people who are open to, who are at least conceptually open to having their mind changed, will accept. Let alone people who are incredibly open, as I was, and remain.
And psychological study shows this over and over again. We select the data that we want, and we need to fight against that daily. That's just part of the...
Yeah, that's probably true. So right now, I would recognize in myself that some of, like when I'm looking at, evidence for the Bible, for example, like let's just say that, that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. You can come up with scenarios where, hey, it's plausible, this bit of evidence lends some plausibility both to eyewitness account and non-witness account. I tend to, when it's a tiebreaker, well, okay, yeah, I actually, since it doesn't disconfirm the fact that I don't think they're eyewitness accounts, yeah, I have some slight confirmation bias that I'm just going to put that in my column as opposed to that column because I'm judging them as equally valid. Sure, there's some of that, or even if it's not a completely equally, yeah, we all have some confirmation bias. That's fine, but it is something I'm actively trying to fight, and I think that non-resistant non-believers, if they exist, are at least aware of these biases and are cognizant of them. And you brought them up, and they're not. This is not news to anyone.
What it is human. So, you and I are Christian theists. The best we can do is present the data and say, here, we think there's plenty of evidence for God. This is what it is. But don't sit here and tell me that humans are reason machines and there really are these non-resistant non-believers.
That's a false dichotomy. We don't need to be reason machines to be non-resistant to new evidence. The fact that I or anyone can make false conclusions, can come to false conclusions, can come to believe false things, doesn't mean that I am resisting true, that I am resisting alternative ideas. It means that, yes, that my brain may have a flaw, or my thinking may have a flaw, or the information I presented I may not fully understand, or may have presented to me poorly. All those things are possible. That doesn't preclude the category of a non-resistant non-believer. That does not follow.
I'm very skeptical based on my understanding of numerous psychological studies that those people just don't exist, unfortunately.
Yeah,
I hope these studies that are not just those two that you talked about, and that you have a whole bunch of others. If you're going to exclude an entire category of people even hypothetically existing.
The problem when you, of course, you say that, and you could be 100% right about that, is that it sounds like an insult to somebody, right? When someone says, look, I'm non-resistant, and you go, no, you are resistant. No, I'm not. You know, you are. So,
Well, even
Yeah, and here's the thing. It may well be that no person can, with great accuracy, or with at least perfect accuracy, be able to tell for themselves whether they're non-resistant or not. But for sure, someone else can't know.
even basic psychology would tell you that when you have stated a belief publicly and then it's attacked or someone says you're wrong, parts of your brain light up that like the flight or fight response just over beliefs. So
Yeah, that may well be true. But for decades, more decades than I care to admit, for decades, I publicly professed my Christianity. And any argument against Christianity, I definitely fought against. And my journey to being a non-believer was full of me, the exact opposite of what you're talking about here. I was publicly a Christian, and yet the arguments against it overwhelmed my state of wanting to stay a Christian. So this idea that, again, the tides can't change, that you have, there are examples all over the place. Sorry, doggy.
even if you may have a desire somewhere in your mind that you do want God to exist, you also have a desire to not be wrong. And when you've publicly stated a position, it's very hard for them to then get out of that. You defend it. You want to.
But very hard doesn't mean impossible. That doesn't exclude the category. Even now, I've said this on my channel enough times. I am incredibly open to being a Christian. I know that you guys can't test that. I'm a full-time YouTuber who questions Christianity. Fine, but I will switch. I know you guys can't believe it, but I actually know that my financial upside and the is huge. If I come back to Christianity, I'll be able to sell all kinds of books and raise money that way for sure. There will be tons of relationships that are currently damaged and not the where I would like them to be that would be fully restored. Also, I would have all these benefits of people who at present I don't think I will ever see again because they passed away. Now suddenly, the option is again open that I will see them again. So the fact that I am publicly professing that I'm not a Christian may well be a barrier, but it is not an insurmountable one. There's all kinds of things, all kinds of benefits for me that, given the right evidence, I'm highly motivated the opposite way, and people should probably question me if I switch. Because, again, there are so many benefits that I gain by becoming a Christian again.
Stay there. Right. And that's just the problem that all of us have. I'm not saying it's just non-believers. Right. Even believers have this, and we all need to wrestle with it.
I suppose you could say to someone who says, I'm a non-resistant non-believer, but I want to believe, is really, how much research have you done? How many books have
How much research have I done, Frank? How many books have I read? I now spend all my life doing research on this. I read like 3 or 4 books in the last week on Christian-themed topics. So, I've read a lot. I've considered a lot. I spent a lot of time on this.
Have you read? How many people have you spoken to?
I've spoken to you, Frank. I've spoken to you.
Are you really on a relentless pursuit of truth? Because a lot of times I ask audiences I speak to, I ask them, I want you to think of somebody, and maybe we could just, those of you listening or watching right now, you can just think about this yourself. I want you to think of somebody you know who's not a Christian, whom you'd like to be a Christian, friend, relative, somebody like that. And everyone gets somebody in their mind. And then I say, I want you to think about that person and answer this question. Is the person you're thinking of on a relentless pursuit of truth? They want to know if Christianity is true, or are they apathetic or hostile to Christianity? Well, it's usually 100 to 0 or 99 to 1 people are apathetic or hostile.
No, that's not what you've determined. What you've determined is the perception of the Christian that person is hostile or actually on a genuine truth test. You're not asking the people to self-evaluate whether they are hostile or whether they're on a truth quest. You're asking someone who is a believer to evaluate a non-believer. I get this all the time. Well, you don't believe what I believe, so you must not be looking for truth. And I'm probably guilty of doing the same thing in the opposite way. Like I admit, when someone's resistant to evolution, at this point, I'm kind of like, do you really want to know? Like, I get it, but the fact that your survey is non-scientific. You are just asking people to psychoanalyze other people, and you've decided that the people in your camp psychoanalyze people in the other camp as dishonest. Big surprise. That's always going to be the case for any out group.
Very few people are on a relentless pursuit of truth. They may say they are. That's why when you ask them if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? They may say yes, but
yep, I would say yes.
They're not doing anything. Their actions contradict what they're saying.
Yeah. And
are you saying, Frank, that I, Paulogia, am not spending any time trying to decide, trying to determine, trying to learn more, trying to do things? Because I think you picked a bad example if you're talking about me.
Even the philosopher Thomas Nagel, who's an atheist, just came right out and admitted, I don't want God to exist.
Right, that's true.
And that's so...
Yeah, so Nagel out and out saying, I don't want God to exist, does not affect me. That isn't like that. Fine. Great. Nagel says he doesn't want God to exist. Awesome. How does that affect non-resistant non-believers? It does not.
Honest of him, I have a higher amount of respect for Thomas Nagel, but he's saying it as it is. Desires go into our beliefs whether we like it or not.
Now,
right. So what about the openly people who's like, I really want Christianity to be true? I talk to people all the time who like desperately want God to be real in their lives, and to the extent where they may not even want to look at further things by their own admission. And I know these are anecdotes, so whatever, but I think probably we're all familiar with people who hold on to the Christian proposition. And does God judge those people? Hey, the only reason you love me, and maybe he will, maybe they'll be part of the goats and the sheep. I don't know, that they too badly wanted God to be real and loved him that way. Like, is that also a sin? Is that also a problem? Or do those people get to go to heaven?
how is it that motivation will show something right or wrong is a fallacy, right? I mean, I could be motivated to believe God does exist, and I could still be right. And Richard Dawkins could be motivated to say God doesn't exist, and he still could be right, regardless of his motivation, correct?
Exactly. Motivation is irrelevant to the argument, for sure.
Correct, absolutely.
Okay. So motivation won't necessarily tell you whether something's right or wrong, but it might be an indicator as to whether or not a person is really open to a new idea or to the evidence if you've provided it to them. Now, what kind of response have you got? And by the way, what is the name of the video?
So one of the responses that he got was my response. Divine hiddenness, inspiring philosophy. I don't think that Mike has responded to my response, which was 3 years ago. It's possible he wrote a blog post. My memory, IP and I have gone back and forth on a lot of different topics, both in video form and in blog form. But I don't think he responded to me on this. Maybe he did. That's something probably should have checked beforehand. Anyway, but I'm quite proud of my response to Michael's response. So that's at least one response he got.
Video. I've saw it months ago. I don't know if you remember the name on your Inspiring Philosophy YouTube channel. Is it just the hiddenness of God? Or
So if you go to my YouTube channel, Inspiring Philosophy, it's Divine Hiddenness, a Christian Response.
Divine Hiddenness, a Christian Response. We can only scratch the surface here, but if you want to see it, I highly recommend you go there.
I hope you guys aren't. This is just. I'm gonna cut this out for later. Hope you guys aren't hearing my stomach. My stomach has decided that I must be hungry because apparently I've gone the holidays. Yeah, I've trained it that apparently every hour I'm supposed to be eating, and I'm trying to, New Year's, try to go back to a more sane meal schedule. My stomach's going nuts here. So anyway, hope you don't. Hope you're not hearing that. Apologies if you are. Okay, so that was Inspiring Philosophy's segment on Frank's podcast. There were 2 segments on Frank's. We're going to look at the second segment in a moment. However, related to this, and I think, if in case I haven't said so, I respect Michael Jones a lot, and I think he is an honest person. I think he's an intellectually rigorous person. I think he's an excellent communicator in all forms. His TikTok channel is my absolute favorite TikTok channel that exists. No offense to anyone else in the chat who also has TikTok channels, because there are some other delicious ones. You know who you are. Anyway, Inspiring Philosophy then went on to, chronologically it was before. He was on Braxton Hunter's channel, Trinity Radio channel, speaking about divine hiddenness recently, and I think that it's relevant to this conversation here as a bit of an addendum, so I'm going to play that now.
And along with me today is not my regular co-host, Jonathan Pritchett.
Upgrade.
A guy asked.
Correct. Michael Jones is definitely an upgrade from your usual co-host. Just saying.
You a while ago. So what's the one thing, is there one thing that people ask you, like atheists might hit you with in a debate or something, and you just are sitting there kind of without a response? I don't really know what to say about that. And I thought you had a decent answer. Could you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, what I said is, like, when an atheist asks, why hasn't God saved me? If you were right and the evidence is so overwhelming for Christianity, why have I not been convinced? And
so this is... Michael, this is someone who's making not the general case for divine hiddenness, which I don't make, in fact. I think that the divine hiddenness argument is only good for me, and each person needs to make it on their own or not, because I can't tell if there are other non-resistant non-believers. It's just not something I can do. So he's just expressed that question, why hasn't God saved me? And that's a super good question that I would love to know the answer to.
I honestly don't know the answer to that, because I can't psychoanalyze everybody. I don't psychoanalyze people, despite what some thumbnails say. I try very hard.
You don't psychoanalyze individuals, which is great. But you have determined from a couple of dubious, really related papers, at least in my view, that whole categories of people just can't exist, despite their self-reporting.
Hard not to be that kind of person, even though sometimes I fail. But the reason is because I can't get inside your brain. But what I will tell them is what
I appreciate that. I appreciate that you do your best to not psychoanalyze. I also do my best. I probably sometimes fail. But yeah, I try. I think that's not a great thing to do to another person. So, and those of you who watch this live channel knows that Braxton and I have had some brush-ups on that front as well, where they've ascribed motive to me personally, but that's also water under the bridge, and hopefully we're all past it.
C.S. Lewis said, honest rejection of Christ, however wrong, shall be forgiven and healed. So
there's that quote again from C.S. Lewis. Again, I think C.S. Lewis pulled that out of thin air. I don't think that can be defended from the Bible, but I would love to be wrong, so let me know in the chat or comments on what theological basis does C.S. Lewis claim that would be the case.
That exists. That's what will happen. But we also should know that from studying psychology, that's just not how humans are. We're not just reason machines. You put in the right input, you're going to be convinced by it. We are a combination of reason and emotions all the time.
We are, but again, I was completely resistant to evolution being true, but eventually the flood of affirming facts overcame my potential bias, and I eventually reasoned to it. So it's at least plausible that highly resistant people can be overwhelmed with evidence.
Sometimes we don't even know why we hold to certain beliefs. People spend years in therapy trying to figure out their own psychology and why they believe.
I actually am fully on with that. That is possible. I entertain that as a category of possible, that I don't know why I don't believe, and that maybe years of therapy would, drive me to determining whether that's a honest position or not. But again, that's between me and God, and I can only I can only know the content of my own thoughts. And since I can evaluate the content of my own thoughts, this is where I'm at. I'm making the best possible decision that I can.
Certain things. And a lot of times we tell ourselves lies without even realizing it, why we believe certain things. I'm guilty of that.
Yeah, Mike's guilty of that.
So are you. That's just.
So am I. Yeah, there's definitely things in my life where I could point to where I've potentially, lied to myself might be a strong word, but I preferred a delusion, and eventually came to it. And I wouldn't, if that was the case right now, I wouldn't be able to identify that. I'll grant that. But what I can do, there are tools one can use to, as you said, like therapy is one. There are other tools a person can use to identify their own biases. And if I'm actively pursuing those, that's the best I can do, and divine hiddenness is still in play.
It's the way it is.
Not me, Shirley.
No, of course not you.
Yeah.
Don't call me Shirley.
So, but that's just the way humans tend to be. So all I can do is present the data and say, look, here's what I think is the best explanation for reality. If you cannot offer a better explanation that has more explanatory scope, explanatory power, more plausible, least ad hoc, I would say I'm still justified in saying this is the most likely worldview at the end of the day.
That's interesting. So most explanatory power, most explanatory scope, less ad hoc, and I forget what the fourth one there was. So Michael feels that the theist position for him is the best one on those cases. This is where I honestly just disagree with you. I think that Christianity and arguments for God are entirely post hoc. Design arguments are post hoc. Ontological arguments are post hoc. These are all, to me, post hoc. Explanatory power. Does the theist position have explanatory, let me go with explanatory scope. Absolutely. If you just want to posit that there is a God that can do literally anything, then yes, that is an answer to everything. There is a scope there, that it is a potential answer to every single question. The problem is that it's not falsifiable. That's the criterion I would add to your list, is falsification. There's no falsification of this theistic God that you guys believe in. And then explanatory power, I do not think that the theist view has any explanatory power, because I don't think it makes unique predictions that would rule out, first of all, anything naturalistic, but are even more plausible under. So, like, even consciousness and some of these things that they put forth as the best case, I don't buy it. What is the unique prediction that theism makes that naturalism, for example, doesn't, or that isn't equally explained under all those? I don't know what it is. I've asked this question many times. What is it, Mike, or anyone in the comments? What is the prediction? What is the predictive power of theism? What?
Mm-hmm. And maybe you have some sort of door closed on your heart you don't realize, or maybe God is just waiting to reveal himself to you in the future. Your story is not fully told yet.
That one is most interesting. maybe your story is not told yet. Maybe sometime in the future, maybe God does have some kind of plan that he needs me, for example, to accumulate, experiences as a non-believer, because he has some purpose for me, so that there's stuff I need to do now, and that the answer is that God will reveal himself fully, but it'll be later. That's pretty tough to rule out. But what you need to convince me then of is that no person has ever... Basically, you have to convince me that every single person who has died would never have accepted God. And that's a tall order. That's not falsifiable.
Can't speak to that, but all I can do is present the data, and that's what I'm going to keep doing.
So anyway, I actually kind of loved this question. Like, Mike, is there a challenge from atheists that you can't answer? And he's like, yeah. Why aren't you personally saved? And I actually really respected that and liked it. I didn't necessarily love all the wrappings, but I think that is a perfect question that, yeah, Mike can't answer for me personally or for anyone personally. Why? And so I respect that instead of trying to psychoanalyze. Though I will say, dismissing as an entire category non-resistant non-believers is pretty close to psychoanalyzing. Just saying. All right. That was, we went on for a bit. That's the Michael Jones. I don't even know what time it is right now. Let's see what time it is. We've been going for a while. I think, though, I'm feeling awake and alert enough to carry on for the last planned topic, which is the second half of that podcast exchange with Frank Turek. I believe that he was at some kind of convention, and there were a lot of other apologists around. Anyway, he brought on another YouTuber, another YouTube personality, to carry on the conversation about divine hiddenness. And we'll take a couple more minutes to, if anyone has to go, I appreciate you, but stick with me because we're going to read super chats. We're going to have conversations. I'm wide awake. It's nearly 2 a.m. Let's go.
Let's talk a little bit about the hiddenness of God. Mike gave us some insights there. Do you have another insight you want to give us regarding that topic?
Yeah. Kind of from a Molinist perspective, if you will, in the sense of, so
first of all, explain Molinism just briefly to people so they know what you're talking about.
So in a nutshell, it's essentially the idea that God not only knows what will happen, but what would have happened had a different set of circumstances occurred. So I have one brother and one sister.
This is sometimes called middle knowledge, as I understand it.
And God knows what my life would have been like had I had one less or one more sibling. And God knows what that would have played out like.
Where do you find that in the scripture?
So it's a culmination of looking at the data. So there are some attributes.
So there's no verse telling him that, but cumulative case, interpretation, inference. And you know what? Frankly, it actually seems to make sense to me. Maybe it doesn't make sense to you that if there's an all-knowing God, it seems like another category of his knowledge should be these knowledge of counterfactuals or knowledge of hypotheticals, for example, that God should, like, if for some reason something prevented me from live streaming tonight, say my internet had gone down, what would I have done with my evening instead? God would theoretically have the answer to that question, right? So it makes sense to me. I don't struggle against Molinism myself. It seems reasonable as a hypothetical, or at least a potential categorization of an all-knowing God.
Of God that are underdetermined. So you're not going to get a philosophical, metaphysical definition of, say, omniscience, but you get this.
I love the word underdetermined. Underdetermined is a delicious word because when you hear apologists use it, or anyone use it really, it just means there's not really a ton of evidence. It's underdetermined.
This idea that God knows all things, all truths. And essentially, the way we would define omniscience is that God believes all true propositions. Now, propositions have different types of tenses. Eric loves Taco Bell. That's true or false? God knows it. tomorrow Eric will eat Taco Bell. That's a future tense proposition. God knows if it's true or false. And then you have what are called counterfactual propositions. If Eric were presented with Taco Bell, he would eat it.
Right now.
That's tenseless. Right now, sure.
Okay.
And that's tenseless. So God knows if that's true or false. So God...
That's actually not a bad explanation. I've heard worse explanations of this position. Pretty good.
not only has foreknowledge, but has counterfactual knowledge of what would have occurred in different set of circumstances.
Seems like he hints at that when Jesus talks about if Tyre and Sidon had repented, or if the miracles were shown in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago. Then
it's funny that Frank brings up that example, because absolutely. So is this not counter to everything that we've been talking about with divine hiddenness? God himself is saying, if I had given more evidence to Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented. But I didn't. So they didn't repent and they were destroyed. Is that like literally not just scripture throwing this divine hiddenness these divine hiddenness rebuttals under the bus?
Sure, yeah.
That kind of thing, right?
And there's even this interesting notion where he says the days were shortened for the sake of this, that, and the other. And so there seems to be this counterfactual knowledge, possibly there even middle knowledge of God having this knowledge of what would have happened in a different set of circumstances.
Okay, so how does this apply now to divine hiddenness? Go ahead.
Yeah. So we have to ask ourselves, well, we do know God hides, as you talked with Mike.
He does. The Bible admits that God hides, which is weird.
He does. The Bible says he does. But why would he?
For someone who loves everyone and wants to have individual relationships with every single person, or so I've been led to believe.
Well, I think this can actually be a sign of God's grace and mercy to a non-believer. And the idea is, Paul has this notion that if it hadn't been for the law, had I not known about the law, I would not have sinned. So it seems to imply that the more knowledge you have, the more
So what we're now getting into is some fringe theology here, at least non-unanimous theology here. The whole notion that this idea that if I hadn't have known the law, I wouldn't have sinned. That's not biblical. Like we sin whether we know. We are counted as guilty of these sins. Christians assure us this all the time, that whether or not we know that what we did was wrong. We should know because it's written on our hearts, right? So if the law is written on our hearts enough to convict us, how is it even conceivable that we don't know it's a sin? And forget A. How is it conceivable if the law is written on our hearts that we don't know it's sin? And the Bible is also clear that we have broken the law whether we know the law or not.
responsibility you incur upon yourselves, because I would say knowledge brings about a responsibility to action to respond to that knowledge and revelation you get. So within Molinism, there's this notion of what's called trans-world damnation, that it's a possibility, I tend to lean towards this, that the people who will be lost in this world would have been lost in any other world God would have created them in.
The Tyre and Sidon example seems to negate that immediately. If God said there's a possible world where I revealed more information to them and they would have repented. So I don't know how you can hold this in light of that example. But it's also, it is fascinating, the idea that, let's say that I am destined to die without accepting Christianity. That means that in every possible world, I would have died without accepting Christianity, including possible worlds where, let's say I had the cancer that I caught shortly after becoming a believer. Like if I had died, well, it doesn't even need to be cancer. Like if I had been hit by a bus when I was 16, when I was fully a believer, that just means like that I was never saved, which is fine. Like that's the whole thing. But there's no conceivable world, no possible world where I could have been saved. Like, okay, then what's the point of any apologetics, right? So that just means that 100% of people who are supposed to be saved get saved no matter what, because there's no even possible world. So let's say that Frank Turek, there was a possible world where Frank Turek doesn't have a ministry, it doesn't matter whether or not he has a ministry, because none of the people, none of the thousands and thousands of people that Frank have spoken to, and I'm sure hundreds of people have written to him saying that you helped me become a Christian or for my faith, none of that mattered. Because in every possible world, where Frank didn't have his ministry, that was picked up by some other slack. Like, you're just asking us to believe a lot of stuff here, which is essentially predestination. And if I'm predestined to go to hell, then what's this all for? What does it matter? That's just where I'm going. Everyone should just stop handing out chick tracts and call it a day, because there's nothing we do here matters.
So, given that they have free will and it's going to be their choice ultimately, well, you're going to have inevitably people that would be going to hell. And now God, I think it's his prerogative to still use those people. Take my former philosophy professor, for an example. It's because of him I got into apologetics, and that's a whole nother long story. And actually, he was my first public debate. And tongue-in-cheek, I went up to him afterwards and I said,
this is starting to sound a lot like determinism to me. I thought Christians were against determinism. Are they? Wow.
I just really want to thank you for allowing God to use you the way he did in my life. And
even though he was an atheist.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Right, okay.
If God is using me as a non-believer, I'm fine with that. If someone wanted to thank me, in fact, I get it in my comment sections all the time. Thank you for strengthening my faith with your arguments. Awesome. Great. I'm just happy that people are having, at that point, a well-considered belief system. If you listen to my channel as a believer and all I do is affirm that what you believe is correct, then awesome.
Okay. So it's God's prerogative to do this. Now, on top of that, if more knowledge incurs more responsibility, I think there are levels of punishment in hell. Mm-hmm. And without going to that, you see Jesus talks about the weightier matters of the...
That is a controversial topic for sure, that there are different levels of punishment for hell. That is definitely not the theology that I held, and that basically that all sins are equal, and that it doesn't matter if you break one commandment or a million commandments. So Jesus himself said, it doesn't matter whether you murder someone. The person who says you fool is equally guilty as the person who actually performs the murder. Or if anyone looks at a woman lustfully, he's equally guilty as the person who actually has sex with the woman. That sure doesn't support this notion that there's degrees of hell. But I'm sure there are counter verses that you probably... That's the problem with theology. You kind of pick and choose your verses and decide which side of the argument you want to go on. I'm sure not going to base my defeat... I don't know how you can base your defeat or define hiddenness on layering maybe upon maybe upon maybe, but that's where we're heading.
Law. Mm-hmm. So not all sins are created equal, nor do all sins...
Yeah, all sins are created equal. Jesus thinks they were.
...have an equal amount of punishment to them. So...
I mean, one can even argue whether there's punishment at all. There are well-intentioned academic Christians who believe in nihilism, that there's no punishment at all. So how you can confidently say that there is a hell, but there's discretionary punishment, I don't know where you're getting that from.
The idea is this: if God knows John is going to reject him no matter what, then he also knows that if he gives John more revelation, John is going to still reject that greater amount of revelation and hence incur greater condemnation in the afterlife. So it then becomes a sign of God's grace and mercy to hide himself from John, to not...
Okay, that's actually a reasonable point. If you accept all these weird premises, okay, let's say God knows that John is going to reject him no matter what, and the more evidence that he's given, the harsher his punishments in hell are getting. So by God revealing himself more, he's heaping more coals on poor John's head. Here's the problem. Why then, if God is indeed being merciful in that way, why is God not sparing John from Frank Turek? Why is God not sparing John from just living in North America, if John is indeed a North American, and being presented, being bombarded with all the messages that his followers are putting forth. Is this not an argument that Jesus's followers should shut up? I almost swore there. Should not say anything? Is not evangelism causing people to suffer more in hell? Since by these premises, it's impossible for someone to die without accepting Jesus if they were gonna, and it's also impossible for someone, to change their fate if they're not going to. So if we're accepting those premises, no one should evangelize. You are making my hell so much worse by just existing and doing your day-to-day evangelism stuff. God's going to save all his elect anyway. So stop apologetics, stop being a Christian on YouTube, on a TikTok, and on Facebook, because you're making hell worse for me. Thank you.
Incur further punishment in hell.
Yeah, this is, I think, Luke 12, where Jesus is talking about people who know about God, but some people know more than others, right?
Yeah.
And he says, to whom much is given, much will be required.
That's right.
And he talks about beating.
That verse, to whom much is given, much is required, I just don't think that relates to hell. Jesus is talking to the saved people, at least in my view. My interpretation of Luke 10 may vary from yours. I know, but there are well-meaning people who believe in the inerrancy of Scripture who would disagree on this passage. So I'm not taking this as a slam dunk argument personally.
Certain people with fewer blows and more blows because of the punishment they've incurred on themselves based on their knowledge. So that may be one reason. In fact, going back to the non-resistant, non-belief people, if those people do exist, and Mike was saying probably not, but even if they do, it could be that God is not revealing himself to them, at least right now, for a reason. Maybe if they stay atheists longer, they'll get more friends. I'm just speculating. Get more friends so that when they do become Christians, they'll have a bigger group of people to influence. I mean, it could be, right?
I mean, that would be an argument for me, I guess. Like, you were waiting for the Paulogia main YouTube channel to get to like 200,000 subscribers, and then I'll become a Christian. So Christians, if you want me to become a Christian, subscribe to my channel so that I have a bigger base, or actually, better yet, encourage your non-Christian friends to subscribe to my channel so that when God eventually does convert me, that I will have a bigger audience with which to profess the gospel. So, yes, I think this is good advice. I think Frank's saying that. Christians, encourage your non-Christian friends and your Christian friends to subscribe to Paulogia in order to save me, so that God can speed ahead to finally converting me once my audience is big enough. Apparently, that's the barrier here. I haven't been successful enough at YouTube to be saved.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's interesting too, is because Moreland has a great book on miracles, and one of my favorite chapters in there is on prayer, and he makes a really interesting point, is that perhaps one reason God is not answering a particular prayer is because there's not enough people involved in that prayer, and the more people you get involved, the more glory he's going to get, because the more people are aware of the situation that needs this prayer, and I think that would apply to what you just said.
Okay, so on that same vein, Christians, I'm begging you for my own eternal soul, my own eternal destiny. Please create a prayer chain, create a prayer circle, invite everyone you know. I want the most number of people in the whole world to be praying for me, that the Holy Spirit will reveal himself to me. Let's get a lot of people invested in this and know about my situation and know about my eternal damnation. Let's make this happen, everybody. It's a numbers game. I don't know what the number of people praying for Paulogia needs to be for it to work. But please, if we don't reach this number, like this is a telethon here, if we don't reach the number of people praying for me, I'm going to burn in hell. And because I study this and I read a lot of books, my hell is going to be worse than most people's, because I've heard all of Frank's arguments over and over again. can you imagine how bad my hell's going to be? How much responsibility I have? Let's get this number high, crank it up. Christian friends, get the prayer circle going. Pray for me. It's a numbers game. Let's go.
A friend of mine who's not a believer right now says, I asked him what would it take, and he says, I think for God to just appear to me. And I said, well, let's pause and think about this. You're a very rational person. People know you as a rational person. What would your testimony be like if you say, oh, how did you become a Christian? Well, God showed up to me. What does that say to every other intellectual friend of yours? Well, I have an
Well, hopefully, this intellectual friend, if you're able to say that God showed up to me, that they would be able to articulate why that friend of yours was able to distinguish between this revelation of God from a hallucination or from other things, or from like that person used some reason and arguments to be able to attribute the experience that he had properly to God. Like that would be a great. I would love that if God appears to me. I will definitely be asking him questions and for verifications of things that I don't personally know, so I can rule out hallucination, right? So if I just asked him, hey, what's the name of my sister? Well, I already know the name of my sister, so my internal voice can give me that answer. But if I ask questions that I don't currently know the answer to, God can give them to me. And then once that experience is over, I can go externally verify those things. And that would be, I think, something I could, not necessarily convincing the other people, but it would at least be part of that good testimony, how I was being a skeptic even about my experience. Right?
If he doesn't show up to me, then I don't need to believe. I said, but imagine if you came as the intellectual you are to believe in Christ on the basis of the evidence. Now, what kind of a testimony would you have? So I think that's one of those instances.
Well, if that your friend there came to become a Christian because of evidence, then the weight of the testimony doesn't matter anymore, right? Because what they would just share is the evidence that convinced them. Like J. Warner Wallace tells me that he became a Christian because of the evidence, and then he presents the evidence. I don't add on top of that the fact that not only is this the evidence I should evaluate, but it convinced J. Warner Wallace. Like that's not an increment. That doesn't add anything to the case. It is actually the case. So either you become converted because of testimonies, or you become converted with evidence. This is not a situation where either one is a problem. Both can potentially solve the problem. So this notion that God is withholding one or the other from me in order to keep the other is stupid. Sorry, it's getting late. I'm going to call things stupid.
Is where, let's say there are non-resistant unbelievers. Well, you're not dead yet. You're still breathing.
That's right.
Yeah. Right? And like you were just saying, maybe God's waiting for the right time, so to speak. He's far more knowledgeable than us, of course, obviously. But this whole idea that God knows the person's eternal choice that he will eventually make and where he'll end up. But I go back to, it amazes me that even though these people are rejecting God, spitting at his face, slapping him, if you will, he still says, and yet I love you, even in your rebellion, to refrain from showing myself to you because I know it's just going to incur greater condemnation in the afterlife, and I love you enough.
So God may love me enough to hide from me. So why can't Christians love me enough to hide from me?
To even keep that much from you.
Let's talk a little bit for a few minutes here about the concept of hell. We talked to Michael Jones about that.
All right. This is actually now he's going to talk about hell for a few moments. Let me know in the chat. What do you think? Should I go to Super Chats and talk more, or should we listen? Should we round out the first bit? Do we want to talk about hell? Do we care? Give me some notes in the chat. We got different. It's going to take a second for you guys to know. Do we want to talk about hell for a few more minutes, or should we move on to Super Chats? All right. Well, we got a delay in the chat, and I don't know. Oh. All right. Looks like we got one vote for still talking about hell. All right. You know what? I'm gonna finish my caffeine. This is just Coke Zero today because apparently this is what healthy living looks to me. There's nothing else in my drink because, man, the holidays were rough. All right, always hell. We got hell sounds. Go for it. Hell sounds fun. Cool. All right, everyone's on board. Couple more minutes. Hang with me. You have to promise now. Those of you who said we'll talk about hell, you got to stick with me for a few minutes.
In your view, is the difference between torture and torment? Because torture is not mentioned in the Bible, but torment certainly is. What is that about?
So now we're going to talk about the nuance. Is it eternal conscious torture, or is eternal conscious torment? And I don't know how this affects someone who. Is this supposed to be like a tiebreaker for me? Like I don't believe in God, but maybe this is probably goes in the Pascal's wager category, because if I don't think the torture versus torment, you'd probably be pitching me torture, frankly. Although that maybe makes your God. Let's see what they say. Torture makes God sound worse, but maybe it wins more souls if you threaten them with something worse.
Yeah, so that's an interesting concept, and kind of Mike was touching on that as well. But I've heard, I don't know if it was Lewis that said that hell's locked, from the inside, and
I love how these guys just take anything Lewis says. So he's positing, oh yeah, if you honestly don't believe in God, He'll just forgive you. The Bible doesn't say that. I don't see it, but C.S. Lewis does. So okay, now we're saying C.S. Lewis. Well, hell isn't locked from the outside, and you can leave any time. Hell is locked from the inside. What?
And Matt, take this thought experiment in that, and I think I've heard Moreland say this. Suppose hypothetically, I don't think this is the case, but suppose hell was like a prison sentence. If you did your time and on good behavior, you get let out. Well,
we're building our case on something we don't think is case. Yeah, no, it's eternal torment. There's no prison. We don't get out ever. That's part of the problem. We have finite crimes. Even if I'm sinning at a rate of 1 sin per second for my whole life, that's a finite number. But the punishment is eternal, infinite, forever. There's no multiplier that makes that math work.
It could be the case, as Mike was saying about torment, that if they keep doing them to themselves, then they'll never get out because they're just adding to their sentence. The more they're being tormented, self-inflicted, the more they're shaking their fists at God, and the more time they're incurring also in hell as well. So, yeah, I would.
So apparently, it's not just this life. We can keep sinning in hell. Forget the fact that somehow all Christians who believe are spared being able to sin in heaven. There can be no sin in heaven. You just, for some reason, your knowledge is such that you don't even want to anymore, or that part of your nature is removed. Look at those lucky people. They will never even have an opportunity to lose their spot in heaven. But everyone in hell will not be spared, will not have the same knowledge. They won't be so aware of the justification for their punishment or how God really must love them. Apparently none of that knowledge from Judgment Day will pass down to them, and they will necessarily continue to resent this punishment. Necessarily. Just automatically 100% of the people. There's not a single person who, while they're torturing, saying, you know what, I deserve this, and when it's over, boy, I would sure love to meet God. Nope. 100% of the people, according to Eric, are gonna resent God. That's not even possible. Like, we are screwed, people. God is not fair. That's the problem with the whole divine hiddenness thing. You can tell me that there's a deity that created us, but you cannot tell me that there is a loving deity who loves everyone equally and wants to give everyone an equal opportunity, because that is not the case under any of these theologies presented today.
Definitely into what Mike was saying about that self-torment. It's almost not even this bitterness towards God. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, look at Adam and Eve, what the woman that you gave me, it's her fault. There's going to be, I could see that in hell happening where people are just continuing this self-infliction of...
You can see it happening versus it necessarily has to happen. It doesn't matter if it happens to you. Let's say we could imagine that there are 99% of people. Is there even 1% of the people or 0.1% of the people who will decide that they decide to still love God and just want to suffer through whatever the finite punishment part is, and instead of adding to their sentence, they get saved? No, there's not.
Well, if you would have just done this, if you would have just done this, and of course God knows that's not the case. That's why I think, going back to a modalist perspective, that by the time you die, God has
If God knows every single person and what they are going to decide without even having us, so even hypothetical scenarios, just there's no scenario where I will accept Christ. Why did he create me? If there was zero, why not just create the people who will accept him? Why create the people who won't? Because I understand that it's my free will under Christian. I don't think free will exists, but under the Christian theology, it's my free will. But that's fine. God knows before I'm born what I'm going to do. There's no reason why he has to allow the non-believers to be on this earth. In fact, why even have the earth? Why not just create us all? Why not create all the people who would accept Jesus? Just skip this part, put them in heaven, and not... If God is supposed to be loving, so loving to me that he's hiding himself from me so I don't get tortured more in heaven, why did he let me be born in the first place? Wouldn't that have been the most loving thing that God could do for someone who he knows would reject him?
sense exhausted what he could do to get you to accept him. And by that time, you've made your choice. And in the afterlife, that choice is just going to continue. And that self-infliction, that torment, that self-pain is going to continue as well.
It's one of the answers to the question, how could we be punished for temporal sins in eternity? Well, one of the reasons is you don't stop sinning in hell, right?
That's right.
No one can not sin on earth either. Like, it's an impossibility of the way God created us to have that be an option to not sin. So the people in heaven are going to be given now a new way of living somehow, that they're not going to sin. But that gift is not given to the other people. So it's not, but it's not about outcome at that point, because it's just an equal opportunity once again.
You just keep building up the...
Christians get to know God exists and choose whether or not to reject and love this God. I don't have that choice. Because I'm not convinced God exists, I cannot choose to love him or not.
The punishment, of course, the other could be the fact that you're sinning against an eternal divine being.
That's right.
And that could be another aspect to it. And of course, you don't, your sentence isn't determined by the length of the time it took you to commit the crime, right? You can kill somebody in 2 seconds, but you don't serve 2 seconds sentence, right?
Trying to add millions of years in.
Oh. And we loop back. So we got to the end. All right, we did it. All right, so that was Frank Turek on interviewing people on divine hiddenness, and apparently a little postscript on hell, letting me know that apparently finite crimes, it doesn't, look, Frank, it doesn't matter. This analogy that, well, it only took you a few seconds to kill someone, but you should serve a long sentence for that. That's still a finite sentence. That's the problem. Even if the factor is 100,000 or 1 million, it's still finite. The problem with hell is it's infinite. There's no proportion there. All that said. Okay. Thank you for bearing with me. We are now going to move to the audience inclusion and audience participation. I'm going to put on glasses so I can read properly. Let's look at our super chats that we've got in so far. Conservative Mirror for $10. Thank you, Conservative Mirror. Writes, AIG Canada puts out a lot of good content to criticize, and I'd be happy to see their content critiqued on the program. Well, that's good feedback. I have considered, given that Ken Ham is putting out less and less personal content of Answers in Genesis, that perhaps that I should move my ham and egg efforts to some of what happens to AIG Canada. I agree. AIG Canada, I think, puts out more solid content than AIG US does in terms of at least video content. So thank you. That's good feedback. David Hepworth for $5 writes, I used apologetics to help me feel smart about young earth creationism, so accepting evolution helped me loosen my fundamentalism and question more about the Bible. Absolutely, I agree. And that's where I think, yeah, Calvin's particular critique definitely failed. I think Answers in Genesis is literally just about making Christians not feel dumb. So, Andrea Vincent is a $10 super chat with no comment. Well, thank you, Andrea. I appreciate the generosity. As you guys know, this is now my full-time thing. This is my first January of being a full-time content creator, so lots of New Year's resolutions on my front relating to the channel and what I'm hoping to do here. Perhaps in other live streams I will talk about those more, but one of them, and it's just gratitude so much for those of you who help this channel through super chats or through memberships or through Patreon, or even if you just are a regular viewer and you click like and leave a comment. Thank you all so much for all that. That really, it's cliche to say, but the channel wouldn't be possible without all of you doing all that, including this live channel. And if you're watching this today and you're not subscribed, I'd love it if you would subscribe to this channel. This is a small channel relative, but it would help me to potentially get more sponsorships and that kind of thing. So yeah, and look, you'll find out when new videos come out. So everyone wins. All right, skeptics and scoundrels. I think the $10 super chat. Order a pizza, Paul. Yeah, actually, my stomach was really growling, and I hope that you guys couldn't hear that. And I thank you so much. Yeah, I probably, well, I mean, the holidays, I ate everywhere I went, there was good food all holiday long, and so I need to tone her down. But tonight would have been, maybe a pizza would have been good. All right, $20. William Ahrens. Thank you so much. William writes, these arguments are what has evangelical Protestants one step away from becoming atheists. Catholic Christianity have apostolic succession from New Testament times. Churches with apostolic office have a faith based in leaders, not ideas. Yes. I would actually agree with that. And I'm not sure where you're necessarily coming from, William. If you're just observing that, I would actually agree with all of those observations. As someone who, I find it far less likely that I could become a Catholic than I could become some form of Protestant again. More so that I just can't understand how, and hold on, and this is absolutely true. Thank you, YouTube Punk. Tagging Paulogia Live will help us see your chats, comments. Yes, absolutely, and we will do some regular chat discussion in a minute here. Yeah, William, I'm not convinced that I would be able to become a Catholic because I just can't see how I could possibly put that much stock in tradition. I can understand how, at least potentially, I could become convinced that the Bible is a reliable document. At least that's a category of things I could accept. I don't understand. I mean, it's not impossible. I'd love for Catholics to come and talk to me about it, how I could potentially even begin to think about Catholics. So anyway, excellent. I completely agree with if that's observations. Completely agree. Azofi, I think. Azofi. I'm gay. How can I come out to my parents? Azofi, I recently put out a video along with my friend Neil 64 Atheist called How to Come Out as an Atheist. I would encourage you to check that out because a lot of that was actually informed from friends in the LGBTQ plus community, of which I'm not, but helped inform that video on how to come out. So, but there's a few things that, again, I think I can say quickly and that are related. One of the things would be, I don't know how old you are and whether you're financially dependent on your family. One of the things you might want to evaluate, if you're financially and your living situation is dependent on your parents, evaluate for yourself how they will react, whether you think that will be something they're accepting. Is it just going to be uncomfortable, or will they actually, cause problems to your life? And if it's going to be a problem, if it's going to hurt you, your ability to live, I guess evaluate for yourself, do they need to know yet? Or can you delay that? The other thing, if you decide that you really do need to talk to them, maybe you're not financially dependent on them, one thing you can do is actually, instead of breaking the news all at once, one of the things you can do is actually break it to them softly. You can sort of get an evaluation. You can, for example, talk about friends who are LGBTQ and discuss hypotheticals or things with them, and try and warm them up to these ideas, and or see if they're going to react harshly. If you let them know, for example, that you have a good friend who has come out as gay, and what do they think about that, that will give you a safe way to evaluate how they may evaluate you. All that to say, I wish you incredibly the best. I know that it is a terribly difficult thing to do for a lot of people to come out. I'm sorry that our world has not yet progressed where this is just a ho-hum matter-of-fact thing, that it is indeed, we live in places where, I'm assuming you're living in a place where it will be a big deal. So all my best on that, and I know that everyone here in the chat is supporting you and wishing you all the best in that, and good luck. But anyway, yeah, please, and also just check out that video, how to come out as an atheist, because a lot of the advice in that should apply to your situation as well. All right, that is it for the super chats, it seems. So let me turn instead to the chat. So YouTube Punk writes, if S.J. Thomason teams up with Cameron Bertuzzi, I think the party's over. We don't stand a chance. Yes, those are two powerhouses. How good. Anyway, no comment, but I think that was tongue-in-cheek, and I would probably concur. I'm not about being an upstager or a grandstander, not a self-promoter nor a monetizer, or the typical blabbing atheist YouTuber, but I do like Paulogia. He may be number one. Well, thank you. I didn't know that this was just going to be a compliment when I tapped on it on screen, but I appreciate if I'm number one in your mind, that means a lot. And even if I'm in the top 100, that means a lot. And I do what I can. Appreciate the... let me see if anyone else has tagged me. Mr. Keenan writes, good show, good chats. Thanks to you all. I appreciate you being here. Wait, Paul couldn't read out chats as well. No, I'm not very good at live streaming, and so if I look at the chat while I'm trying to talk, I get too distracted, so I don't actually look, and I appreciate all my mods who look after all this stuff. Live in the Sanskrit tradition that takes place, the problem of evil is the problem of suffering. Why is existence like this? In an eternal cosmology, there is no answer possible. If you're just letting me know what is the Sanskrit tradition, okay, then I've learned something. I feel like, so this, I know I differ with other non-believers on this, but I do hold that if the God of the Bible exists as is described, the creator of the universe in the way that is described would have the right to behave with its creation any way that it exists. So essentially we would be property, right? In the same way that in general, like if I build something out of Lego, I have every right to do with it. You know, it's Lego that I own. I have the right to do with it what I wish. I know these are imperfect analogies, but, and I also feel like, you know, just that God has sufficient merit and he doesn't owe an explanation to me, and or God may well have reasons that I can't understand and actually could be consistent with perfectly loving, that kind of thing, for some of these evil issues. I know that seems to contradict what I'm talking about with divine hiddenness. The trouble is with divine hiddenness, I actually have extra information that I don't have with general, you know, like why is there an earthquake or why does someone get cancer? Anyway, for me, I don't think the problem of evil is a defeater. I know other people disagree with that. All right, let me go back to live. All right, well, I never hear you say when talking about the tomb, there are no witnesses to Joseph Arimathea cutting into a rock and making a tomb in the Bible. Sure. I mean, there's no reason why Joseph Arimathea couldn't have purchased the tomb as opposed to have cut it into a rock himself. Stone-cut tombs were not something that everyone handmade. There were actually people that was their job, was making stone-cut tombs for other people. So it's not necessarily homemade only, unless I'm missing the point of your comment, Jake. And I guess that would be, I would look, I mean, I'm more excited about eyewitnesses to Joseph Arimathea actually claiming the body or asking the question, like, is Joseph Arimathea even a real person who's part of the Sanhedrin? I would love some of those pieces of evidence before I got down to caring about whether or not he cut the tomb himself. So, yeah. All right. Well, it is now 2:30 in the morning here. So I think with that, it's probably a good time for me to wrap up the stream. Thank you so much, everyone, for hanging out with me, listening to me rant on about favorite colors and divine hiddenness and all that kind of stuff. Those who are watching later, hope you're having a great day. And for the rest of you, also have a great day. Till next time, later.